Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast. Today's entrepreneurs are mental athletes that have to know about the mind and how to keep it fit. Our goal is to increase our resilience against stress and anxiety, optimize our productivity, motivation, and optimism by learning about the human mind through psychology, neuroscience, and human behavior. I'm your host Ozan. I'm a founder who has experienced the challenges of launching and growing a business and a keen student of human behavior over the last 15 years. I'll share with you what I know and learn. Hundreds of impactful, behavior-changing ideas are waiting to be discovered by us. Let's begin now. Emotion and perception, in our analogy, equate to core and balance. So just like in physical exercise, you would need to work on your core strength and balance, and without those you can't perform. You might have done some great cardio training. In our previous episode we've talked about learning and memory taking the place of great cardio training, so you might have done that. But without good core and balance, you would not be able to perform. So these are pieces of the whole. And in our case, emotion and perception are the core and balance in our gym of the mind. So here's the first idea I want you to internalize. Emotion is power. Emotion is raw energy. It is the fuel. No emotion means no motivation to do anything. It is depression. So the way for optimum performance as an entrepreneur or as any creative person that's working on something comes from understanding and managing that emotion. And ignoring the emotion is not managing it. Like here is a social critique. In a world of analytical, rational thinking human beings, we have started to ignore emotion and treat it as something that is potentially ignorable, which is not the case. And this is a limited view of the world that does not necessarily understand how the human brain functions. We cannot ignore emotion because it is not good to ignore emotion, because it is the motivation and the fire. It is raw energy if we can use that. But that raw energy can also be consuming. It needs to be contained in the right type of structure and right mental systems. It can burn too quickly, or it can burn too slow and long so that it eventually dies out. So neither of these work. So your job is to keep it at the right temperature. If you can manage these emotions correctly, and if you can understand them correctly, then you have a bigger potential to position them as these eternal sources of creative energy that will keep fueling you. And then this brings us to another idea. More emotional people therefore have a bigger potential to shine and create greater things. But at the same time, they're at a bigger potential risk of disappointment and to sink when things don't go the way they do. So if you're an emotional person, this is good. This means you have huge untapped potential motivation. But you also need to be careful about positioning and containing that emotion so it does not burn the container it is in, and at the end of the day disappoint. So what are the paths? How do we increase that emotional maturity? And before I go in there, I would like to share a personal anecdote. I've been interested in human behavior because it was also a way to understand myself. And as a person who has studied psychology, had a lot of student classmates who were interested in that. This was a theme I've observed as well. People who have had troubles are more prevalent in psychology classes, I must say, and this is not a bad thing. This is just goes back to our innate human curiosity of trying to understand. So if it is not broken, don't try to fix it. Type of an approach here. People who have had more problems understanding who they are traditionally more interested in disciplines like psychology. But the story I wanted to talk about is, so I've at a young age, I've realized that my performance actually varied quite a bit. At times I was overperforming, incredibly easy to understand and perform well in some topics, and I was getting the highest grades, incredible encouragement from my teachers. Everything was going great, and I felt more motivated to do that as I got those positive feedbacks. But at the other end of the spectrum, and this one I experienced when I was at university, I got some negative feedback from some of my instructors and some of the professors, and as a result of that, I found that I was more discouraged. I found it more difficult to concentrate and more difficult to motivate myself. And it was especially the time I needed to motivate myself, because I needed to increase my grades and be at a better position. But I was not able to find that energy within myself, and it was a difficult thing for me. It was like this vicious, destructive type of a loop. And I experienced this in my professional life as well. So this is something that I know about myself. When I get good and positive feedback, it just encourages me to like conquer the world type of a feeling. But when I have potentially negative news and negative feedback, then it just pushes me down. So because I know this about myself, I now know the tactics to keep myself always afloat and able to breathe. So this is also another theme, knowing about yourself in that sense. But let me share with you some keys, some ideas that are potentially showing the path to emotional maturity. The first is look within and learn to decode the emotion you're feeling and when you're feeling that emotion. The self-discovery I've just talked about came as a result of this. Look within and learn to decode what emotion you're feeling. The second one is learn about micro expressions. I mean, pause this podcast and look up what micro expressions are, and look at the major 7, the big 7, all those facial expressions, those micro expressions. They are actually the gateway between the facial expression and that emotion, and they are the key emotions like disgust, anger, happiness, sadness, and so on. And also learn about more nuanced and complex emotions. Don't just stop there. And learning about the names of these emotions will give you the tools to think about those emotions and to appreciate and to actually recognize those type of emotions. It is difficult for you to. So the human beings, as a species, spent more than 5,000 years to put a name to these. So you should take advantage of those rather than trying to discover what each emotion is by yourself. The third one is practice introspection, especially at times when you're highly motivated, when you're highly discouraged or depressed, or highly agitated or angry. So the idea here is these peaks, they give you the clues. So ask yourself this question: what am I really feeling now? Why am I feeling that really? What was different than my expectation? So ask yourself these questions, especially at those peak times of emotion, and looking back to those emotions that you've learned about, try to identify which one of those you're feeling. The fourth one is about tactical intervention. So these are geared towards acute moments of those peak emotions. So how do you contain yourself? Failing to contain yourself, failing to contain that emotion does not always necessarily mean, and this is an important idea, failing to contain that emotion does not necessarily always mean an outburst of externally visible anger or sadness or happiness. More often than not, it might be a misjudged, biased, mistaken opinion that you form about something that you might internalize. So imagine you are furious with yourself, and as a result of that, you think about the situation you're in, and you make an emotional judgment call, a decision about why that situation resulted with gave that result, and you you take it as a learning, but it is a mislearning. It is not the reality, and you were not able to look at that situation as objectively as you could because you were not able to contain that emotion. And this is like the seed of a misjudgment. It is the seed of a wrong idea that might otherwise cause problems down the line. And this is actually how people lose that grip with motivation, and this sometimes leads to depression. So the fifth one is strategic intervention. And here you think about the longer term. What are the emotions you experience throughout the day, throughout the week, the month, the year? Try to identify the themes and the commonalities. What is good, what is difficult, and so on. And try to work on them. So I've also talked about perception. Emotion is one part of the puzzle, but the other part is perception, and they go hand in hand, because without perception you cannot form an emotion most of the time. The key idea is there is a world out there. I know that there's a world out there, and there is a reality potentially, but I personally, as Ozan, I don't know what that reality is like. I only know of my perception of it. And this is the same for everybody else. We only know of our perception of reality. And every time we experience a surprise, this might be in form of a disappointment or a positive surprise, something unexpected happening, this is actually the moment, the exact moment where those two worlds, my perception of the world and the world itself, collides. And I can take that as a learning opportunity, or I might not. So here's another personal experience that I had. So when I came to London, before I came to London, I had an idea about how business life, how startups, how the technology ecosystem was like. But it was a perception, it was not the reality. I still don't know what the reality is, but now my perception is closer to the reality, if that makes sense. And the reason why my perception is closer to the reality than 3 years ago is that I have had a number of experiences, both positive and negative, with people, with companies, with the general tech ecosystem here, with startups, with other entrepreneurs. And those were actually the intersection points, the collisions between my perception and the reality itself. And it was unexpected. It was at times disappointing. It was at times encouragingly surprising. But those were the opportunities to actually align my perception of this ecosystem here with what the ecosystem is like. To give a specific example, I would think startups would be paying more attention to, at least they would be more open-minded rather than traditional in terms of trying new technologies and starting new partnerships with new people. But the reality, my current perception is it can be quite conservative still, going back to British roots of preserving tradition. I think. So this was one example. So 3 key ideas on managing that perception. First one, perception sets the stage for your emotions. So a misperception will set a stage that is skewed towards creating more dysfunctional emotions. The better your perception is, the closer it is to reality, you'll have a better stage that is less skewed towards creating more dysfunctional emotions. The second one is better perception can be achieved through a growth mindset. Learning and accepting how often you can be wrong is a superpower. Every surprise or disappointment is an opportunity, actually, as I've talked about, to synchronize, to align what that world is like versus what you think that world is like. And lastly, perception improves by, most of all, vicarious observation, looking at the same world through other people's eyes, looking at the tech ecosystem through the eyes of other entrepreneurs, other founders, other consultants, people who work in different corporate jobs, people who work in small businesses, people who do creative stuff. understanding their perception of the world and comparing that perception with your perception is a reality check. This is also the base of our sanity in a way. We all need reference points, and these reference points are actually very important. So to sum up, emotion and perception are the core and balance in our gym of the mind. The idea to internalize is emotion is power, is raw energy. For optimum performance, you have to find ways to maintain and contain it and make sure it burns at the right temperature. More emotional people have a bigger potential to achieve greatness, but they're also at a bigger risk group in terms of disappointment. The path to emotional maturity goes through understanding what those emotions are and learning to decode with introspection. Learn about micro expressions and the emotions they are tied with. Practice introspection, especially when you're highly motivated, highly discouraged, etc. at those peak times. Tactical intervention is looking at yourself during those acute moments of peak emotion. So the strategic intervention is thinking in longer term, identifying what the themes of the emotions you feel over the months and years and weeks are. And on the perception side of things, the perception sets the stage for your emotions. Misperception will set a stage that is skewed towards creating more dysfunctional emotions. Better perception can be achieved by growth mindset, and perception improves by vicarious observation. So thank you for listening. I hope this was useful. Make sure to take a look at other episodes of this podcast. I'll see you and talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.